night, in the year 356 BC, in the Macedonian sky, the stars were twinkling brightly, more intensely than other nights. It was as if mystical voices whispered by the breeze spoke of the mysterious powers that would accompany the child of Macedonia who would be born at dawn the following day. The great hour of a great day had arrived. Alexander was born in Macedonia, a man chosen by destiny to change the history of the world. In the year that Alexander was born, a political commentator, Socrates, addressed the crowd of Greek-speaking peoples, saying, "Greece is suffering from war, revolutions, massacres, and innumerable hardships." This terrible social decline was the result of an entire century of civil wars between city-states and internal conflicts within these cities. During that period, Plato creates the swan song of his dialogues, the famous Laws. In it, the great sage, deeply distressed by the civil wars, describes the ideal city-state in the belief that this would contribute to reconciliation of the states. Right up to the last moment of his life, he saw before him a vision of reconciliation which never came. At the heart of this turbulent time, Alexander came into the world, the son of Philip II, King of Macedonia. Since then, hundreds of volumes of books have been written about Alexander. After 2,400 years, he continues to exemplify worldwide the young conqueror who, within the space of 13 years, managed to change the course of world history. His victories against Greece's enemies established him as a mortal demigod who surpassed the bounds of legend and the bounds of history itself. There were two main people who played an important role in shaping the spirit and intellect of Alexander the Great: his mother, Olympias, and his wise teacher, Aristotle. Philip of Macedon first met Olympias in Samothrace, where he had gone to be initiated into the Caverian Mysteries. The king of the Macedonians was greatly impressed not only by the beauty of Princess Olympias of the royal house of Molossia, but also by her dedication to the ceremony of the mysteries. Philip asked for her hand in marriage from her uncle, Arivas, the king of the Molossians. Olympias had an explosive temperament. She was profoundly religious, sacrificing to the Olympian gods and supervising the rituals of the mysteries in which she was involved. She would sit for hours and hours with her son Alexander, telling him about the secret cult rites of the Caverian Mysteries. From his childhood years, Alexander learned that the Caveri were virtuous spiritual beings who lived at the bottom of the sea, dominated by the kingdom of Poseidon. The Caveri knew the secrets of fire. They used this knowledge to become master craftsmen in metalwork. Olympias would explain to young Alexander the allegory of the elements of metal and fire. Metals were the crude, unrefined material elements of nature, spiritually and intellectually coarse people. Fire was the spiritual light, that which penetrates cosmic matter and the human body, that which reaches the inner sanctum of the soul and the mind, to raise them up to the heavenly spheres, to the brink of the perfect spiritual and intellectual form. You too must lock inside your soul the greatness of the Caverian, Olympias would urge Alexander. Orpheus, Hercules, Jason, Odysseus, Agamemnon, your father Philip, all the great men of the world were initiated into the Caverian Mysteries. On their walks with Alexander, Olympias also spoke to him about the cult of Orpheus, his descent into Hades, the kingdom of Pluto and Persephone. The soul-stirring myth of Dionysus, who brought Persephone back to life with a kiss, the awakening of the soul from the darkness to the light, the miracle of love, and the unique Orphic songs were for him the paths leading to divinity. Olympias also taught Alexander the mysteries of the Orphic theogony, the cosmic egg, the birth of finance, the divine light that sparked from ether to spread throughout the world, the creation of the Titanic sin, the revenge of the Titans on the divine form of Dionysus, the death of Dionysus, the lament of the forces of darkness, the coming of Athena to the world of fire, who took Dionysus' heart and carried it to Olympus, to the father of the gods, Zeus, where a new Dionysus was reborn, even greater, stronger, and more illustrious. From his childhood years, Alexander learned to be pious and just, to excel in every kind of spiritual development. He had to be able to submit to the will of the gods, the mystical depth of the gods, the mystical depths of invocations to the gods, and his realization that the most moral thing is the best shed the divine light of godliness on his soul, which passionately sought to identify with the very soul of the gods. This created within him the aspiration to unite men with divinity itself. From a very young age, he believed that man was part of the gods and could be deified as an individual who seeks to become part of universal divinity. Olympias exerted a very strong influence over young Alexander. The profound religiosity that she imparted to him prepared him to accept the power of the gods in any kind of worship and any type of cult. Thus, his soul was illuminated by the light of the universal soul, universal humanism and world unity through the friendship and reconciliation of peoples. Alexander's adoration for his mother was well known throughout the kingdom of Macedonia. Once he had said, "One of my mother's tears cancels out all the innumerable accusations contained in the letters of the supervisor Antipatros." In the year 342 BC, Philip of Macedonia hired Aristotle for a large fee to teach young Alexander philosophy. Their lessons and discussions on topics of a very high intellectual level usually took place outside of the sanctuary of the nymphs near Mysa, a beautiful place with caves in rocks. Since the time of Plutarch, it has been considered a very impressive sight. The great sage would talk for hours to young Alexander, who listened to his teacher's scientific views and advice with the profoundest respect, attention and admiration. The influence exerted by Aristotle on Alexander's mind and soul was enormous. The eager student was initiated into esoteric secrets and the natural events of cosmology, geography, botany, zoology, and medicine. Because of this, he always took scientists from all these disciplines with him on every campaign. His eyes open wide with awe and admiration, young Alexander listened carefully to Aristotle's discourses on logic, metaphysics, types of poetry, the importance of politics on a local and universal level, and above all, the nature of the soul and its essence.
Aristotle believed that man had in his nature the power to create a state. In other words, he is a political animal by nature. This means that man can find his true vocation only through the organized state.
When Alexander once asked Aristotle, "What is a state?" his teacher replied that a state is a complex entity composed of citizens, and a citizen is he who, as an equal member, can participate in governing and in meting out justice. Alexander was not convinced that the existence of an organized state with happy citizens was a simple matter. The stories he heard about people living in places from the Asia Minor coast to India, the hunger, misery, unfair treatment of the poor by the rich, and in particular the ignorance, created in the soul of the young visionary a universal image of a better state with happier citizens. This could exist if only the conditions of government were changed to ensure that culture and knowledge replaced misery and ignorance. When Aristotle taught him that it is in the state's interest that the government and the armed forces are in the same hands, Alexander envisaged before him the road of civilized conquests, which was decreed by his own destiny. The defining aim of the state is the happiness of the many, Aristotle had declared dogmatically. Is a person allowed to believe that he can intervene and strive for a better world? Asked Alexander. Yes, replied Aristotle. The philosophy schools in Athens and Ionia teach their students that even one man can rectify the entire community. And in fact, if a man thinks he has within him the power to change the regime of the state for its citizens to have a happier and more just life, this thought is a commitment to the gods, and he is obliged to strive for its realization. If a modern observer wanted to detect the natural potential concealed within Alexander the Great, allowing him to change the world map through his conquests, such an observer would have to be able to hear the words of Aristotle describing the soul and its substance, and at the same time to see with the eyes of his own soul the words of Aristotle penetrating into the mind of young Alexander. This meeting point between Aristotle's words about the soul and Alexander's own soul defined the victorious army's commander's crossroad of history. Because in reality, Alexander did not become great for his conquests, but for their essence. Behind every victory, Alexander could see its essence, and this is what transformed the conqueror into a visionary and the defeated into beneficiaries. Aristotle taught Alexander that his every move in space and time should never be based on chance. Since everything has an aim, man must strive to realize that aim. During a battle, he who instigates the movement must have defined from the very outset the main aim of the attack or the resistance and its essence, which constitute the why and the because of the battle. Alexander had to be able to see everything in his life through its esoteric essence. The body is the rented house of the soul, Aristotle taught him. Every move of the body and every aspiration of the mind for conquest should have as its defining aim the enhancement of the soul. Because the body disappears and only the soul remains. Alone it will enter the world of the gods at the crossroads of the suns, or into Hades, the dark world of Pluto. Aristotle's words may bear mark on Alexander's life, forging the scope, speed and brilliance of his intellect in making military decisions. At the tough battle he waged at Gorgomer and Hydaspes, he was able to foresee the precise sequence of his forces' movements and the damage they would inflict on the enemy. The prominent commander, Ptolemy, noted, the result was always as Alexander had conceived from the outset. None of the operations he undertook were beyond his powers. Arrianus also wrote, Alexander had the wonderful power of seizing the right movement, even when the situation looked nebulous.
From the time he landed in Asia, Alexander knew that he had to create his own kingdom there in order to win the willing cooperation of his subjects. The training began with young children from Sardis who would become soldiers in his kingdom. His sagacity was demonstrated in the development of the rivers, the Indus, the Tigris, and the Euphrates. In his mind, he immediately transformed them into floating roadways for trade, and he organized a new system of irrigation in Mesopotamia. His ability to make the right move in all his actions and his capacity to think ahead for each new project were verified in many situations, especially in shipping between the Persian Gulf and the Indus River Delta. Persian Gulf and the Indus River Delta.
Alexander grew up in a kingdom that was continually at war. Concealing within the depths of his soul a hero who had to disregard any kind of danger. He was always in the forefront of battle. He considered a real hero to be one who based glory on bravery, and a real leader one who set an excellent example for his fellow soldiers by his active participation in the battle. At crucial moments of his life, he could hear Aristotle's voice guiding him to make the right move in any kind of necessity or danger. The Aristotelian model heroes, which Alexander had to imitate in his life, not only to reach their level, but to surpass them, were Philip, Kairos, Hercules, and Dionysus. At this point, Arrianus writes, if he had added Europe to Asia, he would have been competing with himself, because there was no rival. Aristotle had told Alexander that in order to discover which was the supreme value, he should compare at least two values to ascertain the better one. Comparing the Egyptian, Babylonian, and the Indian ideas with the Greek, he firmly believed that not only were the Greek ideas superior, but they were also unique with the passing of each era. with a strong belief in Greek education, the incomparable Greek language, philosophy, art, poetry, literature, architecture, religion, and its profound cult rituals, he made it a decisive purpose of his life to conquer, immersed in superstition, suffering, and spiritual deficiency. As he entered each conquered country, he would bring the light of Greek civilization, a return of Greek wisdom, art, and education. Alexander established cities in Asia whose leaders were Greeks, familiar with democratic institutions and the principles of just government. Aristotle's thought was always in the back of his mind. A real conquest is the introduction of light into darkness, and a real conqueror is he who conquers the souls of his defeated rivals. With these basic principles in the mind and soul of the victorious army commander, the new generations in the Greek cities of Asia were now educated according to the model of Greek education, art, and science. Alexander zealously established Greek schools everywhere. In his Ethics, Plutarch informs us that when Alexander died, the procedure of founding new schools was already well underway.
When Alexander brought civilization to Asia, the reading material for the first grades were the epics of Homer, and the children of the Persians, the Susians, and the Gedrosians used to sing the choral excerpts from the works of Sophocles and Euripides. Because of Alexander, Bactria and the Caucasus turned to the worship of Greek divinities. In mystical Egypt, which at the time was deeply immersed in occultism and mysticism, Alexander introduced a textbook in the late 3rd century BC, which was specially designed to teach the Greek language as an official foreign language. The textbook contained excerpts from Homer and the great Greek dramatists.
Excavations in Afghanistan brought to light Greek temples, a theatre, and an odium next to a large Asian sanctuary of the 4th century BC. Modern-day views of Alexander the Great underline his major role as a bearer of Greek civilization, whose influence in education left its mark on the people, particularly of Eastern countries, right up to the present day.
Alexander had profound faith in the traditional Macedonian religion. Every day his thoughts were devoted to God, and he performed sacrifices under both normal and difficult conditions, even when he was ill. Every one of his successes and every element of his existence he believed were owed to the grace of the gods. In their honor, he organized festivities with extraordinary magnificence. Like Pindar, he believed in the presence of the Olympian gods in the world, and in the superhuman feats of the legendary heroes Hercules and Achilles, whom he considered his ancestors. At the supreme moment of cult worship, Olympias would appear before his eyes when she spoke to him as a child about the Caverian Mysteries. From his childhood memories, he had retained as an eternal concept that the deities demonstrated their will through natural phenomena, through the oracles and prophecies expressed by divinely inspired men and women.
If a modern-day observer were to take an imaginary journey through the mind of Alexander the Great, with the aim of discovering the deepest essence of this incredible man, unique in world history, he would arrive at some new conclusions about the authenticity of his personality and his spiritual feelings. Let's begin with the religious Alexander. Religion, for Alexander, constituted a person's supreme expression of his obligation to the deity. God was very much alive in the soul of the great military commander. Esoteric voices in the depths of his being spoke to him of worlds of light, of a life beyond, that all actions in this world should remind him that the law of the stronger is love for his inferior. Through his religion, the great conqueror believed that one did not fight because he hated, but fought for justice, and above all, showed the requisite respect for his rival. It is well known from Marianus and Plutarch how tough the battle of Issus was. The confrontation between the forces of Alexander and those of Darius ended with the victory of Alexander. Persian hordes who for centuries had plagued the world, and particularly Greece, destroying temples, sacred sites, monuments and trophies at the Acropolis, Delphi and Olympia, had finally been defeated. The painting by Jean Lebrun depicts Alexander accompanied by his friend Hephaestion visiting the prisoners in their tent. Sisygambris, Darius' mother, thinking that Hephaestion is Alexander because he is taller, falls at his feet, begging for mercy. Without showing annoyance at the mistake, Alexander explains that his friend is also an Alexander, and the women should not be afraid because Greeks have boundless respect for their prisoners of war. Alexander falls in love with Darius' younger daughter, Statira, but she confesses to him that she loves a Persian nobleman. Alexander forgets that he is a conqueror. He forgets the rights of the conqueror over the defeated. Bowing his head, he respects her decision and stifles his erotic passion for her with all the majesty of a divinely inspired military commander. In 324 BC, at a major symposium, attended by 9,000 officers and elders from all the tribes he had conquered, Alexander swore an oath, which he himself had written, demonstrating his magnanimity, his unbiased love for friend and foe, and his faith in the religious ideal and his worship of God.
Έχουμε στην υγεία σας.
With the conclusion of the war, I now wish you to prosper peacefully. From now on, all mortals are to live as one people, in harmony for common prosperity, to consider as your universal homeland with common laws wherever the excellent rule, irrespective of race. I do not divide people, as the narrow-minded do, into Greeks and barbarians. Citizens' place of origin does not interest me, nor does their race. I categorize them only with one criterion, that of virtue. In my opinion, every virtuous Greek and every virtuous foreigner is a real Greek, and every evil Greek or foreigner is a barbarian. We must not think of God as an autocratic ruler, but as the common father of us all. On my part, I consider everyone equal, white or dark-skinned. You are all one to me with God's love. Do not merely be participants in my commonwealth, but participants and partners. To the best of my ability, I will try to carry out what I have pledged to you. With tonight's libation, keep this oath we have sworn as a symbol of love. Following the conquest of Gaza, Alexander led his troops towards the city of Jerusalem. The high priest Iardus was overcome by fear and concern about the behavior of the Macedonians and ordered the people to pray and beg God to save the nation. When the high priest went to sleep after the sacrifice, he heard the voice of God, who told him not to fear. Instead, The city was to be adorned with garlands, the gates were to be opened wide, and the people, dressed in white, were to welcome Alexander. When the high priest woke up, he told everyone of the prophecy, and did everything he saw in his dream. When in a region called Saphis, Alexander met the priests, and the citizens dressed in white, and the high priest in his finest robe of gold-plated headdress, on which was written the name of God, he approached him alone. Needing with profound respect and humility, he embraced the high priest. The kings of Syria and all the leaders were stunned by Alexander the Great's behavior, while all the Judeans surrounded him with expressions of adoration and admiration. At some point, Apollonian dared to ask Alexander why he had knelt before those who should have knelt before him. Alexander, his face illuminated by a divine ecstasy, replied, "I did not kneel before the high priest. I knelt before God himself, in the person of his representative, the high priest, whom I had seen in my sleep, dressed just as he is now, when I was in Dion, in Macedonia." Once more, Alexander, with his profound belief in the religious ideal and in the complete knowledge that he could reach God only through magnanimity and humility, showed that the conquest of Jerusalem and any other city was an act ordained by God, who was guiding his steps at every moment of his life. Following his triumphant victories in Issos and Gorgonella against the Persians, Alexander in 331 BC entered Babylon victoriously, the great metropolis of the East. The satrap, Zeus, met Alexander outside the walls and handed over to him the city of Babylon. As Alexander headed his army along the procession way, the priests and the people welcomed him, offering precious gifts and strewing his path with flowers. For the Babylonians, it was the end of 200 years of Persian rule. All their temples had been pillaged by Xerxes. Once again, the voices of Olympias and Aristotle, which resounded in the depths of Alexander's soul, led him to the right decisions. Under the guidance of the priests, he made sacrifices in honor of their chief deity, Bel. He approved their requests for restoration of the temples of Babylon and gave orders to the people to repair the damage wrought by Xerxes' army. In a frenzy of joy, the Babylonians welcomed him as a liberator and as an envoy of their god. Alexander appointed the Persian Zeus as political administrator and satrap. The Macedonians were surprised at their leader's choice, as they could not comprehend the magnitude of Alexander's majesty and the acuteness of his political thinking. He believed that he should honor the defeated, especially the Persians, in order to minimize the degree of their resistance to him and his army, and so they would contribute, although defeated, to the completion of his plans. In a letter to Darius, Alexander wrote, "I honor in a manner worthy of their status the Persians who distinguish themselves." And when the Persian Mithrim handed over Sardis without resistance, Alexander appointed him satrap of Armenia. Behind each such initiative, which characterized his ethos, his political and strategic thinking, and above all, his emotional moderation in every decision made by the great military commander, a modern-day researcher can detect the high standard of education acquired by Alexander next to his spiritual father Aristotle, and the practical application of these teachings in each of his decisions and actions. Alexander the Great and his conquests provided a splendid subject over the centuries for painters, sculptors, etchers, writers, and poets. In earlier years, from Raphael to Gustave Moreau, they read three writers from antiquity in order to glean information about Alexander: Plutarch, Arrianus, and Quintus Curtius Rufus. Occasionally, they derive information from the historical library of Diodorus Siculiotis. Some of the monumental works of art pertaining to the life and activities of the great military commander were Alexander and Vitus by Louis Lagrange, 1787. The work depicts the Persian satrap's devotion to Alexander. Abbassiceris, at the grave of Alexander the Great, by the Greek artist Fotis Kontoglou, 1938. Alexander and Diogenes by Gaspard de Caillet in the 1620s. Alexander and Diogenes marble relief from the period 1671 to 1679, Louvre Museum. Alexander's sacrifices at the grave of Achilles by Thomas Blanchet from the period 1614 to 1689. Alexander's visit to Troy by Francesco Futabasso from the period 1707-1769. The battle at Granicus River, this wonderful work by Charles Lebrun dates back to 1661 and is in the Louvre Museum. Alexander cuts the Gordian knot, painting by Johann Georg Platzer from the period 1704-1761. The rescue of Alexander from the waters of the Cydnus, painting by Johann Georg Platzer from the period 1704 to 1761. Alexander Pan, dating the 4th century BC, on his head are two small horns, like Pan. This work is on display at the Pella Museum in Macedonia. Alexander orders the founding of Alexandria by the painter Piacido Constanzi from the period 1702 to 1759. The triumphant entry of Alexander into Babylon, a painting by Charles Lebrun in 1665 at the Louvre Museum, and the marble head of Alexander the Great dating to the 4th century BC and exhibited at the Pella Museum.
Carefully observing the superb statue that depicts Alexander's Pan at the Pella Museum, you can see the harmonious physique of the young military commander. Without being at all excessive, it emanates vigor, strength, and inexhaustible energy. Alexander exemplified the Greek ideal of kalos kagathos. This ideal was instilled in him by his teacher Aristotle, who advocated daily exercise for the attainment of perfection in body, mind, and soul. Hamlet of Museum advocated daily exercise for the attainment of perfection in body, mind, and soul. Hundreds of museums, art galleries, and private collections all over the world exhibit works pertaining to the life and activities of Alexander the Great. Never in the history of the planet was a mortal so adulated by the peoples of both the West and the East as Alexander the Great. His image exhibits the bounds of legend. Writers, poets, painters, and sculptors still continue today, and probably will forever, to extol the glory, the courage, and the strength of this marvelous man, whose timeless image sheds the light of inspiration on every type of art.
In 332 BC, Alexander arrived in Egypt, which resembled a vast cemetery, torched, pillaged, and destroyed by the hordes of Cambyses and Ocon. The young army commander liberated Egypt from the hate of Persians and restored the temples of Karnak and Luxor, as well as the sanctuary of Ammon. The temples then enjoyed a new period of religious revival. For the Egyptians, the god Ammon was the creator. Today, visitors can see in the heart of the temple Alexander in the role of a demigod pharaoh, making a sacred offering to Ammon, the god he knew from his childhood years. Endeavoring to follow in the footsteps of history, Diodorus the Latin informs us that in the spring of 331 BC, Alexander headed towards the Libyan desert from Memphis with a small military force of detachments from the units of adjutants, archers, and the royal cavalry. The pilgrim's journey continued through Mareotis along the coast up to Paratonion, and from there into the vast, scorching sands of the desert. The journey took 1.5 months. The difficulties, adventures, the torment of thirst, and the blistering hot desert winds frequently provoked despair and frustration in all members of the group, except for Alexander himself. The young conqueror considered of supreme importance a meeting with the representatives of the greatest and most powerful priesthood in the entire Mediterranean region. When the priests of Ammon saw from the watchtower Alexander and his retinue approaching the sacred site, they sent a group of priests to escort the military commander. Diodorus and Curtius Rufus have noted that the priests led Alexander into the main temple of Ammon. Alexander appeared before the priesthood as a successor and heir to the pharaoh. This was exceptionally significant, as according to the country's religious views, this was the natural temple of the sun god, and his personification, the power that linked man with divinity. So, in this case too, Aristotle's influence on Alexander's religious notions relating to worldwide cult worship played a very important role. A dialogue followed between the prophesying priest and Alexander, while at the same time the priesthood had ordered a sacred ritual and divining ceremony in Ammon's honor. The prophesying priest, acting as the god, took Alexander inside the sanctum and conveyed to him the prophecy not with words, but with gestures and symbols, as Strabo informs us. However, Callisthenes notes that the high priest eventually violated the rules of silence. Because of the utmost importance of the god's pronouncements, Alexander had not only to listen, but also to comprehend every single detail.
Alexander the Great's bold and extremely dangerous undertaking, risking his life and the lives of his men to reach the temple of Ammon, had a deeper reason than merely that of political advantage. The prophecy imparted to him by the priest of Ammon was a spiritual need, his relationship with divinity, his origins from the lineage of the gods, the aim of his existence in this world, his common roots of Hercules, Dionysos, and Theseus, his divine mission. All of these agonizing issues tormented the soul of the young military commander.
His presence in the temple was as familiar to him as being in his childhood home. For his entire life, Alexander was known for his piety and devotion to divinity. Right up to his death, he could never liberate himself from that unconquerable power which impelled him constantly towards the altars and temples of the gods. No one has ever learned what exactly was said between the priests of Ammon and Alexander. However, when he emerged hours later on the portico of the temple gardens and his men saw him from afar, they all felt that they beheld before them a different Alexander. An Alexander who did not seem to be touching the ground, serene, calm, and bathed in the luminous aura of the divine light. The great man of history had embraced his roots. He had seen the non-visible. He had communicated with the light. He had heard the inexpressible and had been persuaded of his divine origin. After his profound experience at the temple of Ammon, Alexander and his army went east and arrived at today's Afghanistan. Subsequently, in Pakistan, he waged a terrible battle with the fearful war elephants, winning a marvelous victory. Here we see a coin depicting Alexander attacking an elephant. And he appears on this Egyptian coin wearing an elephant skin. This means that he took the animal's strength and made it his own. Within the space of 13 years, the Macedonian warrior, the son of Philip and Olympias, managed to overcome and vanquish the mightiest war machine of the last 2 centuries, the Persian phalanxes, which supported the greatest empire of the world at that time. The phalanxes that had destroyed the most important temples in Attica, Olympia and Delphi. The phalanxes that provoked fear and terror in the peoples of the East and the West. Alexander changed the course of world history. Macedonia basked in the glory of his dominance, and his people, in a frenzy of enthusiasm for their young leader, were ready to deify him. Vitruvius writes that Alexander once heard from the mouth of the architect Dinocrates, probably the boldest proposal ever made to a mortal on this earth, that the whole of Mount Athos, where today's monastic community is located, to be transformed into a giant statue of Alexander. As we can see in this etching by Johann Fischer, 1656 to 1723, Mount Athos has taken the shape of a giant Alexander, who holds a town of 10,000 inhabitants in his left hand, and in the right hand a receptacle holding the waters of the mountain's rivers, which then flow down to the sea in the isthmus opened by Xerxes. Alexander listened carefully, awed by Dinocrates' daring proposal, but he considered that accepting the creation of such a colossal structure would be far too ambitious and extreme. It could be regarded in the future as an arrogant monument, representing self-deification and disrespect towards the gods. The reason given for his refusal, which impressed Dinocrates and his advisors, was that there was not sufficient cultivatable land at Mount Athos. However, within him, Aristotle's teachings were uppermost. His great teacher's voice sent a message to the depths of Alexander's soul that he must try, as a mortal, to reach the heights where he can see the gods, but should never try to equate himself with them. Where he can see the gods, but should never try to equate himself with them. It was a hot day in May, in 323 BC in Babylon. In accordance with custom, Alexander made sacrifices to the gods and divided the pieces of meat among his soldiers in all the battalions. Later, he dined, drank, and conversed with his friends until late at night. Subsequently, with a few more friends, he visited the home of Medius, where he had been invited, and they drank copious quantities of wine. For the whole of the following day and night, Alexander fell into a deep sleep, while a high fever began to rage in his body. On the third day, despite the fever, which blurred his gaze and made the world appear to swirl around him, he asked to be carried in his bed to the altar in order to perform the sacrifice. His profound faith and desire to be close to the gods was stronger than any physical weakness that plagued his body. As night fell and the fever reached the limits of his endurance, Alexander, his voice reduced to barely a whisper, gave orders to his commanders for the Arabian campaign, which had already been organized. Plutarch tells us that Alexander went on like this from day to day as his strength gradually seeped away. Overwhelmed with grief and pain, the Macedonian soldiers passed silently one by one through his room to see their beloved king. Alexander, his eyesight failing as the fever took its toll, would raise his hand with great difficulty in a gesture of final farewell, inclining his head slightly. As the days passed, death approached Alexander, but up to the very last moment, the proud Macedonian, shortly before falling into aphasia, called for his aides and spoke with them, making plans and issuing orders in a gesture of final respect. Outside the chamber in which their king was dying, his soldiers, who worshipped him like a god, counted down the hours of life for the man who had led them for 13 years from one glorious victory to another. On June the 10th, in the year 323 BC, Alexander the Great closed his eyes forever. At the age of 32. The man who in the short space of 13 years had changed the map on the face of the planet and the history of the world in general, his body now still and cold, allowed the tears shed by his friends to fall on his lifeless form. The first flame with the message that Alexander had died appeared behind the walls of Babylon. Then a second, and a third, and a fourth. The mountain tops from Babylon to the Indies, and to Macedonia, and to Atalanta in Sicily, echoed with wails and cries of grief, with flames and smoke that ascended in morning, rising up to the ethereal heights. And among them fluttered the soul of Alexander, flying up to the heavenly sphere, to the cradle of the Olympian gods. The most fascinating question for the scientific community today is, where is the dead body, the mummy of Alexander the Great? A Greek archaeologist, Liana Zouvaji, has worked intensively in the Sivar Desert in the past few years. She passionately believes that Alexander, according also to the stories told by local inhabitants, is buried here under the hot
desert sand near the temple of Ammon Zeus.
That Alexander is buried in Siwa, I am very positive.
The world media has shown tremendous interest in Liana Suvalji's research in the Egyptian desert, Siva. In contrast, Greek archaeologists have been more cautious and reserved about the site of the excavations. Despite the Greek reservations, Liana Suvalji and her colleagues continued the research, convinced that the Siva desert conceals the body of Alexander the Great in its scorching embrace.
Alexander is buried here.
So far, Liana Suvalji's dream, which is also a worldwide dream, has not become a reality. The ruined temple of Ammon, the Siva oasis, the earth of Egypt is keeping its mouth firmly closed. Shortly after Alexander's death in 329 BC, and for the next 600 years, conventional history has it that he must have been buried in Alexandria. However, speculation is growing in research circles about the discovery of the grave. If one considers that today's Alexandria, that modern, lively city, is built over the ancient town which lies deep in the earth. Over 100 years ago, Egyptian archaeologists found a real labyrinth of burial chambers. It was an accidental discovery after a donkey fell into a hole together with the cart it was pulling. Optimism that Alexander's burial site may have been found later gave way to pessimism. A labyrinth of underground passages were Roman catacombs which were being used since the time that traces of Alexander disappeared. A burial chamber guarded by Egyptian demons with Roman legionnaire uniforms impresses visitors. However, once again, Alexander's grave was not found, hidden in the murky darkness of the past. The writer and director of this film, Paul Pisanos, had a unique experience involving the grave of Alexander the Great. In the spring of 1999, he was informed by a Greek working on Amman, Jordan, that Alexander was buried there, very close to the ancient Greek area of Gerasa. Paul's surprise was even greater when he was told that he could see Alexander's grave and film it if he paid the sum of $150,000. Paul traveled to Amman and met with the people who assured him that they could lead him to the person who knew the secret of the grave. However, he had to make sure that this story did not involve a swindle or some kind of hoax. He asked them to describe the grave to him so we could ascertain the authenticity of the information. A white-haired, well-dressed Jordanian with a serious appearance, speaking fluent English and giving only his first name, gave him a great deal of information, which Paul noted in meticulous detail. His name gave him a great deal of information, which Paul noted in meticulous detail. The Jordanian said that in order for him to be taken to the grave, he must agree to be blindfolded. At the point where his eyes would be uncovered so that he could see the grave, he would have to pay the $150,000. Then he would be blindfolded once again and led back to the same place from where they started. As the proposal involved a certain amount of danger and unforeseeable events,
Paul Pausanias decided to go back to Athens, then return in a month in order to complete his trip and see the grave. In conversations Paul had in Athens with archaeologist Rania Chagari, professor of Aristotelian philosophy Dr. Stanley Sfikas, and other distinguished experts, he sought to ascertain whether the information he had been given by the Jordanian was scientifically sound. Some of the main questions that Paul asked his associates were the following. Was the sarcophagus containing Alexander's mummy crystal? Was it deep blue in color on top and had transparent white crystal at the sides, so one could see the mummy of Alexander? Was the sarcophagus filled with a strange liquid that covered Alexander's entire body? Are there historical or other references to this liquid? When Alexander's body was moved from Babylon to Alexandria or somewhere else, was the marble council table, together with his throne and the seats of his 12 aides, taken with it? Could Alexander's half-brother Aridaeus, who moved his body 2 years after his death, have changed the body for another? At the Syrian border, could he have handed over the first body of Alexander to Ptolemy and buried the real Alexander in secret catacombs under Ammon? Archaeologist Rania Chagari expressed the view that the crystal sarcophagus could have been the real thing and that the council table and the throne and chairs could have accompanied Alexander's body in a special carriage. But Dr. Sfikas stated that such information does not exist in the writings of Arrianus, Plutarch, or Rufus, so they have no scientific authenticity. However, the turbulent era in which Alexander died and the conflicts of those who remain behind do not rule out the possibility of an eccentric plot to replace Alexander's body with another and bury it elsewhere. The white-haired Jordanian had also divulged another amazing piece of information to Paul, the scientific validity of which he wanted to check. He claimed that the entrance of the chamber at the end of the gallery, where Alexander was buried, had a magnetic field, preventing the entry of visitors to the site of the sarcophagus. Paul visited the Democritus Research Center and asked the scientists there if it were possible for magnetic fields to be artificially created, capable of absorbing and eliminating any material body that passes through them, and able to repulse the human body, preventing it from entering the area. The scientists said that this was inexplicable by today's science, therefore not accepted. In reply to Paul's question whether it was impossible, the answer was, in nature, nothing is impossible. Excited by the idea that he might see Alexander's grave, even though its authenticity seemed unlikely, and that he may be able to give science the key to the story involving the most important mortal's grave of all time, Paul went to Ammon once again and met with the same people. However, this time the difficulties were even greater because the group of Jordanians, and particularly the white-haired man, were obviously extremely worried that Paul may have revealed the secret to a third person, especially to people in the Jordanian government. There is no point in discussing the numerous problems that arose preventing Paul from seeing Alexander's grave even after 4 trips made for that purpose. However, he felt it was necessary to construct a computer-generated image of Alexander's grave as it was described to him by the Jordanian with the white hair. Perhaps what we will see may not belong to history, but exists only in the imagination of some people. But the following description is so impressive that its reconstruction seemed essential. Under the warm earth of Ammon in Jordan, they say that there is a labyrinthine complex of underground galleries, which the white-haired Jordanian had called the New Palace. Most of these galleries have an unusual communications network with stone or marble doors which open vertically like garage doors and not like ordinary ones. Ancient Greek columns and statues are scattered throughout the galleries. In these rather indistinct photographs taken at the entrance to one of these galleries, we can see stones which bear inscribed Greek letters and a low-relief crest that is not clearly distinguished, but which the white-haired Jordanian claimed was Macedonian. This photograph shows the antechamber of the gallery, which purportedly houses the grave of Alexander the Great. At the entrance, which is exceptionally narrow, down on the stone floor, 3 animals are carved: a crocodile, a deer, and a serpent, inside a circle. To the left of the entrance, chiseled into the rock, is the head of an African woman. As soon as the visitor steps on the 3 animals to enter the gallery, he feels a peculiar pressure on his brain, a loud buzzing in the ear canal. When the visitor proceeds a little further, these sensations disappear. The colour of the stone is a light greyish-white and is slightly shiny. Among the entire length there are texts etched into the rock, which contain excerpts from the epic of Homer's Iliad. The shape of the cavern is similar to a worm, or the letter S. After the first 6 meters from the entrance, we see quite a large opening to the left and right, which could be likened to the swollen belly of a worm. On the left are 6 small stone seats with a stone bench in front, while on the right there is only 1 stone bench. Proceeding for the next 6 meters after the worm's belly, and as we approach an opening with 3 ascending stone stairs, we can feel a slight pressure which continues to increase until it stops us completely. The white-haired Jordanian called this pressure an obstruction and maintained that if we continue, it will kill us or will throw us violently backwards. From the point where the pressure is slight, according to the Jordanian, we can see a circular chamber behind the opening with a magnetic field. This chamber could be likened to the huge round head of the worm. On the left is the sarcophagus of Alexander. The mummy is wrapped in a shroud, like the Egyptian type, but the head is left free. The sarcophagus is made of crystal, which is deep blue on the upper surface, while the sides are transparent white. The Jordanian noted that the mummy appeared to be covered by a strange liquid, completely still. Perhaps it is not liquid, but something else, he said at some point. On the sarcophagus lie Alexander's sword, shield, and Macedonian helmet. Down on the stone floor and slightly in front of the sarcophagus are gold rods, which create a large, brilliant beam. In the background, exactly opposite and slightly in front of the sarcophagus, are gold rods, which create a large, brilliant beam. In the background, exactly opposite the opening, is a half-open stone garage-type door, but one cannot see what lies behind it. Carved on the door is the head of Alexander and the inscription, Alexander, King of the Macedonians. On the right, exactly opposite the sarcophagus and at a vertical angle, is a large marble council table with 6 marble seats along one length, another 6 marble seats along the other, and a throne-like seat at the head of the table. On the throne is a bird. The white-haired Jordanian said it symbolizes he who will come again. Standing along the edge of the burial chamber are small ceramic jars filled with strange liquids. The entire chamber is uniformly illuminated by a bluish stone in the shape of a heart, which stands on a metallic stick sunk into the stone floor. Even more peculiar is the fact that there is no trace of dust anywhere. The Jordanian maintained that in the spherical chamber of the sarcophagus, everything is sparkling clean. Concluding his story, he told Paul, when they had arranged everything, those who placed Alexander in there activated the magnetic field. Since then, up to now, and perhaps forever, the chamber will not be violated by the entry of a human being. After his last visit to Amman, Paul, having collected as much information as he could, discussed once more with Dr. Svikas and Dr. Karayanis whether the story about Alexander's sarcophagus could be true. To the question that arose, how did the sarcophagus with the real Alexander find itself in Amman, and how did the false sarcophagus arrive with pomp and ceremony in Alexandria, Paul replied with the Jordanian's assertion that Aristotle had made sure that the shrouded Alexander was replaced with another body shortly before the opulent royal carriage left to be pulled by 64 mules from Babylon to Alexandria. The Jordanian also claimed that Alexander's body did not remain in Babylon for 2 years, but for 4 years. And when Ptolemy of Egypt intercepted the carriage with the body of the false Alexander at the Syrian border to take it to Alexandria, the real body had already been transferred to Jordan. Can any light be shed on this mystery? A serious possibility is that Alexandria shelters the sarcophagus of Alexander under the new city, just as it hosts the bodies of his royal successors, the Ptolemies of Egypt. From one sole source, we learn that his magnificent mausoleum is in the form of a pyramid, similar to those of the illustrious pharaohs. Those who passionately seek the mummy of Alexander also say that the great secret is concealed under the mysterious graves of the Ptolemies. Other historical sources inform us that Alexander's sarcophagus was made of gold, just like the sarcophagus of Tutankhamun. However, when one of the Ptolemies needed money, he substituted it with a transparent one of crystal or alabaster. Perhaps this story could be connected with Alexander's crystal sarcophagus in Amman. Alexander's main sarcophagus was seen for the last time in 215 AD. Subsequently, the official sources of information are lost in the darkness of ignorance. Perhaps the body, together with the sarcophagus, was burned in Alexandria during an uprising in 270 AD. Maybe Alexander the Great's loyal followers secretly took the sarcophagus to El Baraki in Siva. The more the pages of history are shrouded in mist, the more interest is aroused among international historians and archaeologists in finding the most legendary body of all time. Alexandria, Siva, Macedonia, Ammon. Nothing can be ruled out. In between the probable and the improbable, God always places a query. Man has to strive to find answers to this question so that people can experience progress.
Behind Alexander the Great's every major thought or act, we must seek Aristotle. The young man had the opportunity to learn from the greatest scientist sage of the ancient world, who once told him the highest virtue of man involves the activity of the soul.
Plutarch notes that Alexander fervently believed that a real king is one who conquers himself and not others. On every philosophical theory of Alexander's about man, the soul, and the world, Aristotle placed his own mark. It was he who planted in his student's soul that if he strives to conquer the peak will belong to him. In cultivating the soul, Alexander sought the peak. In relation to friendship, rivalry, reconciliation, valor, courage, patriotism, and generosity, he sought the peak. In his visions, his planning, his conquest of cities and states, in the dispensation of justice, in the demeanor of victors towards the defeated, and in honoring the dead, Alexander sought the peak. Alexander the Great envisaged the society of the gods. He saw clearly before him Hercules, Theseus, Dionysus, Apollo, and Zeus. These ideals, the eternal ideals of the ancient world, activated within him the cosmic mechanism that united man with the divine. Poets, writers, sculptors, painters, historians, and musicians throughout the ages have praised and glorified the greatest hero of all time, Alexander, a student of Aristotle. He who not only conquered the souls of people, who not only defeated the Persians and the barbarians of his era, but who defeated